If you ask me, I think the M2 MacBooks are some of the most controversial Apple products we've seen in a while. The headlines have been dominated by issues, complaints, and negative press, and a lot of people seem hell-bent on trashing the M2 MacBook Air in particular for whatever reason. So in this video, I want to answer two questions. Firstly, what is the reality? At the end of the day, is the M2 MacBook Air a good laptop? And even if it is, why are so many people hating on it? To start off, I want to first talk about the M1 MacBook Air briefly, because I think it's affected people's perception of the M2 MacBook Air quite a bit. Now, when it was first released in November 2020, the M1 MacBook Air was nothing short of revolutionary. I mean, amazing battery life, very impressive performance, decent features, and at a pretty affordable price. It was a far cry from the previous generations of Intel MacBooks, and even other laptops from competing brands at the same price point. So now that we have the M2 MacBook Air, which is improved in almost every way, the difference between it and the MacBook it replaced just isn't as big as it was with the M1 MacBook Air and the version it replaced. And if you combine this with the 20% price increase and a few overheating and SSD controversies thrown in, that's more than enough to tarnish the reputation of what otherwise could be an amazing product. So let's talk about the M2 MacBook Air and why I actually think it's quite good despite all of the negative press out there. And then after that, we'll get into why there's so much controversy around this MacBook. Starting with everyday use, let's throw out all the benchmarks and performance comparisons for a second and talk about how this MacBook performs for the average user. Now, the best way I can describe it is M1 2.0, right? Everything we liked about the M1 MacBook Air is here, and most of it is improved. I mean, the screen is bigger, brighter, and more colorful. The keys are very, very comfortable to type on, even for long periods of time. The webcam is 1080p instead of 720p, which, although isn't a huge change, it is a great upgrade for those frequently working from home and doing virtual meetings. And don't forget, the return of MagSafe is also a very welcome addition because it frees up one of those Thunderbolt ports. Although I still wish there was one extra Thunderbolt port, or at least one on the right side of the MacBook. And annoyingly, you still cannot output to more than one external monitor, which is a deal breaker for a lot of people. Anyway, all of these upgrades, alongside a slightly more powerful and capable M2 chip, result in a machine that will chew up pretty much anything you throw at it. Within reason, of course. I mean, more intensive tasks like compiling code, editing, Lightroom photos, and even video editing perform very well. And I was outright shocked at just how capable this machine was in areas where I thought it would fall short. There's a reason why programmers, photographers, and other professionals love these entry-level Apple Silicon laptops. And if you want to see a detailed performance comparison against the M1 MacBook Air, I will link that video if you're interested. That being said, most people won't be doing anything super intensive on a MacBook Air, and I think at the end of the day, it's mainly a productivity device. And unsurprisingly, this is something that it also does very well. Multitasking between 10 Safari browser tabs, all open at the same time, with a 100,000 row Excel spreadsheet, a large PDF document, Slack, Spotify, and Mail, all of these apps running at the same time and switching between them, is responsive and smooth. And the best part is there's never any fan noise, which also means you can have this MacBook sitting on any surface without worrying about dust or blocking the fan intake. And with the same impressive battery life as the M1 MacBook Air, you're going to go at least 10 to 12 hours before needing to plug into the wall. And even then, the M2 has fast charging, allowing you to charge to 50% in just 30 minutes. Assuming, of course, you fork out a bit extra for the 65-watt charger though. So yes, the M2 MacBook Air does its job very well. It's a great all-rounder laptop with some impressive performance when you need it, and great battery life and build quality to match. Okay, so let's get into the controversial stuff. Now, I've covered all of this extensively in previous videos, so I will link these where necessary if you want to look into them in more detail. Firstly, the SSD issue. Yes, the SSD speed on the base model 256GB M2 MacBook Air is much slower than the M1 MacBook Air. It's hard to say if this was Apple being greedy and cutting costs, or due to supply chain issues, or both. I do believe that most people won't notice or won't care, but that's also not an excuse for Apple either. Apple markets this device as an improved, more powerful version of the laptop it replaced, and for it to be majorly lacking in one area paints a pretty confusing image for potential buyers. And when you combine this with the overinflated reports of the M2 chip thermal throttling and running too hot, which I have discussed in many videos, hint, yes, it does get hotter than the M1, but it's not a major issue. All of this makes people think, in what other areas could the M2 MacBook Air be lacking? Did Apple cut corners when designing this device? Or could this even be way less of a value proposition when compared to the tried and trusted M1 MacBook Air? And when you hear all of this and then go onto the Apple website and see the price, which is 20% more than what you were expecting, sometimes a lot more depending what country you're located in, I think it's easy to see how many people would just decide then and there to not bother at all with the M2 Air, especially when you consider that a lightly used M1 MacBook Air can be bought for almost half the price of a brand new M2 MacBook Air with none of the controversial issues and most of the performance. That being said though, I think the final nail in the M2 Air's coffin is that Apple still ships this device with such entry-level specs, aka the tiny 256GB SSD and only 8GB of RAM. Yes, I know, most people won't be doing anything intensive enough to notice, and for the RAM at least, I tend to agree, but shipping a $1,200 laptop in 2022 with a 256GB SSD should just not be a thing. And you might not know this, but Apple likely only pays about $10 for each 256GB SSD NAND chip. So instead of just going, hey, you know what, it's 2022, apps and files are getting larger, 128GB NAND chips are hard to source, let's just make the base model SSD 512GB and absorb that cost into our already eye-watering profit margin. Well, no. Apple said, screw you guys, and shipped the base models with inferior SSDs, half the speed of the previous M1 MacBook Air. Now, going back to the RAM for a second, like I said before, shipping the base model with a 8GB RAM option and not 16GB is forgivable, but you do get some massive performance gains by upgrading the RAM, making the M2 Air 50% faster in some situations. And a lot of these situations were exactly what the Air was designed for. Now, a lot of this performance difference is due to the way unified memory works. Obviously, the CPU and GPU also needs to use your RAM on an Apple Silicon Mac, not just programs and apps. And I found in a lot of situations, 8GB is just not enough. And you're essentially starving the M2 chip and not giving it enough RAM. But that is a topic for a separate video, should you get the 8GB RAM or the 16GB RAM version. And I will also link that down below. Now, one thing I also want to mention here is that I don't think we're seeing Apple's ideal Apple Silicon MacBook Air just yet. With the M1 MacBook Air, even though it had this awesome new Apple Silicon chip, the chassis was very basic and outdated. And with the M2, I don't think the chassis was designed with the M2 chip in mind. Currently, both the M1 and M2 chips are using something known as a 5nm process. And if you look at the reports coming from analysts, Apple has been trying to move to a new and improved, smaller 3nm process. Without getting too technical here, 3nm is preferable because it allows for higher performance while requiring potentially 25 to 30% less power, which also means the chip will run much cooler. And you can see how something like this might be advantageous in a fanless laptop. Now, obviously due to supply chain issues, the pandemic, and global chip shortages, this has been delayed, but I do believe this is the end goal for the MacBook Air, and is what the current M2 chassis is designed for. A much smaller, cooler, and more efficient chip. So yeah, like I said, the M2 MacBook Air is a really solid device, and I'm excited to see how the next version of the MacBook Air performs, because, like I said, it has a lot of potential. Unfortunately for the M2, it's just not a big enough improvement from the M1, and combined with the price and these arguably minor but really weird issues at the end of the day, it all just results in a product that hits the mark for some people, but for a lot of other people doesn't quite come close enough.